Okay, so we're on Peham at Aleph 85a. We started a little bit of a new topic. So we are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8 lines from the top. First word, Tashman, a new brisa, which is going to be discussing similar things that we've been speaking about, different places to acquire, vessels of the buyer, vessels of the seller. Tashma, the brisa teaches, Arba Midos Pemochrin. We're going to talk about 4 different types of scenarios where the seller is selling something to the buyer. So now, scenario number 1. So now, the seller and the buyer both, they want to go through a transaction. However, they need to measure out exactly how much is going to be in the sale. So they go to a third party and they borrow a measuring vessel. And now the seller is using it to fill up the measuring vessel until he hit the top, and then he knows that's how much he's selling. So until he fills it up, the vessel belongs to the seller. Once he finished filling up the vessel, now it belongs to the buyer. That was the deal of the borrow. So they borrowed something. That was a deal. So we're talking about a measuring cup which does not belong to either one of them. So now, as long as the seller has it, whatever he's filling up, that cup still belongs to him. As soon as that cup is full and he's measured out the requisite amount, so now, even though it's in his possession, but from that point forward, once it's already filled to the top, it's going to belong to the buyer. So right now, when the seller is holding it, you have a good example of an object which is in the seller's possession, but belongs to the buyer. Once it's filled up, the seller's holding the buyer's object, full with produce. So from that point forward, that the buyer can acquire such a thing. The same way if a buyer walks into a seller's house with his own basket. Right now he's in the seller's house, but he's holding his own basket. We said earlier that if you have such a case, the buyer can acquire even in the seller's domain. So this is another example of that, where you have an object which belongs to the buyer. It belongs to the buyer as soon as it was full. Once it's full, it belongs to the buyer. Right now, the buyer can acquire the produce inside the basket, even though the seller is holding it. Because now that it's filled up, that was part of the borrowing deal. That was from the third party. So, yeah. Okay, so all of this is the first case, is talking about where they've acquired a measuring cup or a utensil to measure from a third party. Let's say the measuring cup belonged to either the seller or the buyer. So then, Rishon Kana. So then, whoever's cup it is, whoever's measuring item it is, so then they acquire whatever goes in it. So if the cup belongs to the buyer, so then as soon as the seller puts produce into it, the buyer's acquired it. And if the selling cup is the seller's, so then as long as he has it and the food that he's putting in there, it belongs to the seller. Morning, Steve. Morning. Yeah, okay. So that's case number 2. So now we say, Bamed Dvar Mamurim. Where is this case taking place? Where are they standing? Where's the location of this sale? Bamed Dvar Mamurim Birishus Harabim, in a public domain, Ubechatzer She'ena Shel Shneim, or it's in a courtyard that does not belong to either of them. And that's where the first 2 cases are taking place. So there's a novelty here, because the first case was where the measuring cup was the third party's. The seller is holding the cup. He's filled it up to the top of whatever he needs to measure. Now it belongs to the buyer, but the seller is still holding it. And even though they're in a public domain, Kalev Shelkona can work even in a public domain, which was the topic of our conversation, the first line of this Amud. Right, if you look at the first line, it says, Kalev Shadam Konala B'chol Makom, chutz mirishus harabim. And then Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish said, even in a rishus harabim. And Rav Papa was the one who said, they don't really mean a public domain, they're just talking about a simta. But according to this brisa right now, it sounds like Caleb Shalkona, the vessels of a buyer, could acquire an object for him, even if the seller is holding it in a public domain. So we'll come back to that. Aval Bershus Mocher, however, if you were in the backyard, the domain of the seller, so lo kana, the buyer, just because the seller is holding the measuring cup and it's filled up to the top, and the deal was as soon as it's filled up to the top, it belongs to the buyer. So now it's really the buyer's vessel. But if the seller's holding it in the seller's domain, meaning in his house, let's say, so then Bershus Mocher lo kana achi yagbiena, until the buyer does a kinyan hagbah, he lifts it up. Oh, achi yotziena mirshuso, or he takes the cup and removes it from the seller's domain. But just the fact that the seller is holding the buyer's cup in the seller's domain, that's not going to acquire it for you. So once again, there's details here, but it makes logical sense. An acquisition is when you're showing that you're bringing something into your possession. So now, if you're in a public domain, and now that measuring cup belongs to you because it's been filled up already, the seller has no more use for it. Right now, in essence, that's your domain. That inside that vessel is your domain. So that could be enough to acquire something. But if you're in the seller's house, when have you done anything to show that you've acquired the object? The seller's holding your vessel in his domain. So what have you done? Nothing. What? Right? And you can't say, what do you mean? But it's my vessel. It's your vessel, but it's in the seller's domain. So that the Brisa says now you have to do more. You have to do either lift it up or you have to remove it, physically remove it from his possession. Bershus lokeach. What if now the same transaction is happening, but we're switching locations? It's in the buyer's domain. So the seller has a measuring cup. He filled it up to the top, but he's in the buyer's domain. There we say, Kevan shekibel alav mocher kana lokeach. There we say, as soon as the mocher agrees, let's say he filled up to the top and he agrees that this is the amount that he wants to sell it to the buyer. As soon as they decided on that amount, even if the seller's holding it, if you're in the buyer's domain, then you've acquired it. Because once again, the cup that he's holding belongs to the buyer. So as soon as the seller decides, I'm selling you 5 pounds of potatoes, and he filled up the measuring vessel up to 5 pounds, right then and there, it belongs to the buyer. Okay, that was the third case. Bershus halo hamufkadim atzlo lo kana achi kavel alav o ad sheyisker es mekomo. So now, this final case is you're in someone else's field. You're in the mocher. The mocher has deposited his foods by somebody. So now you're in that guy's backyard, a third party's backyard. So there, the buyer has not acquired anything until until the buyer, it says achi kabbalah, until basically, so let's say you're the seller always he deposits his potatoes in my backyard, right? So they come over to my backyard to make this acquisition. The only time the buyer, right? Imagine Steve's the buyer, comes to my backyard, and Jules, you're selling Steve, 5 pounds of potatoes. So if it's happening in my backyard, so now what happens is the only way Steve can acquire it is if I give him the permission to go use that area, or he rents it from me. Either of those cases, so now that's like it belongs to him. That area belongs to him. Once that's true, so then he has acquired those the produce. 1 second. Yeah. So either the nifkad is the one where the fruits are deposited by. Either he lets me acquire things in his domain, or I rent his domain. I rent that warehouse where the potatoes are. So those are our 4 cases of in this brisa. So whether you're in a public domain, whether you're in the domain of the seller, whether you're in the domain of the buyer, or whether you're in the domain of the person that the produce has been deposited by. So those are the 4 cases. So says the Gemara, Kitani Miha, but what do we need? Why do we bring this whole thing up? Because we had this discussion on the top of the page of how do you acquire things in a public domain. So says the Gemara, Kitani Miha, nevertheless, we taught Birshus Harabim, Ubechatzer She'ena Shel Shnehem. What happens if the seller is filling up a measuring cup? It gets filled up to the top. Now the measuring cup, it now belongs to the buyer. As soon as it's filled up to the top, the deal was, it then now belongs to the buyer. However, they're standing in Midtown Manhattan. How's it going to work? So the brisa there says that if it's in Rosh Hashanah or B'chatzah She'ena Shel Shneim, so he acquires it. The seller's holding the buyer's vessel, and yet the buyer has acquired the items inside the vessel. And where is this taking place? Birshus Harabim. So that's exactly the second line of this Amud said, Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish said, you can acquire something afilu Birshus Harabim. And the first line said that Rav and Shmuel argued on it. So we're bringing now a brisa to prove that you can acquire things that are in the buyer's vessel, even if you are in a Birshus Harabim or in a Chatzer She'ena Shel Shneim, which means a courtyard that doesn't belong to either person. Okay, turning the page. So it says,
why wouldn't that work in the third party's place?
Why would that not work in a third party? I guess you need his permission. You cannot acquire things in someone, meaning where have you shown that it's yours? The backyard is mine and you want to buy something.
But if it's in if you put it in your container.
Right, so if you're in, right, so if you put it in your container.
If you put it in Rishus Harabim, in my container,
right,
as the buyer.
Right.
It becomes mine.
Right.
Why not in your house, in my container?
Good question. I guess you have to say is that in Rosh Hashanah, so it's nobody's. So there, it's a little bit counterintuitive. Since it's nobody's, you can view it at least like it's yours right now. But if it's for sure someone else's property, so I can't go to someone else's property and say, oh, those potatoes are mine. You've been depositing potatoes there for many years. The guy needs to give me permission to use that area. So when the area is for sure someone else's, it's harder to acquire when the area is ownerless. Yeah, good question. It says the Gemara, Ma'ilav Rishus Harabim Mamish. Are we not? I mean, it says Rishus Harabim. Turn the page to Peham Beis. So are we not talking about a Rishus Harabim Mamish? And if that would be true, so then that's going to back up one of the opinions that says you can acquire something even in even if it's if the seller's holding your vessel in Rishus Harabim. So we said lo simta. We do the same thing again. Even though we call the Rishus Harabim, it's referring to a simta, which is that that emergency lane on the highway. That area near Rishus Harabim. But the Gemara says, what do you mean? It says v'had dumya de chatzer she'ena shel shneim katani. What do you mean? The brisa said it's a public domain, which is or a chatzer she'ena shel shneim. So a chatzer she'ena shel shneim, the comparable case to that would be a Rishus Harabim, a place that's just as ownerless. So says the Gemara, Mai chatzer she'ena shel shneim, nami delo hai kula v'lo de hai kula, elo de tzirayu. Said no, that's fine. A chatzer she'ena shel shneim is also similar to a simta because they both belong to nobody. So even though they both. What did you say, Steve?
It's the property of. It's not the property of either of them. It's the property of both of them.
Saying a chatzer she'ena shel shneim is really the property of both of theirs. So my chatzer she'ena shel shneim nami delo de hai kula v'lo de hai kula ela de travayu. So meaning like this: as long as the chatzer she'ena shel shneim was an ownerless area, it was more similar to a public domain. Now we're saying that the chatzer she'ena shel shneim belongs to both of them now.
Belongs to both. It's not the property of either of them.
Rather, it's both of theirs. and therefore it's similar to a simta. Yeah. So we're saying that this court right now really belongs to both of them. So therefore you can't ask on a brisa, what do you mean? It's the equivalent of Rosh Hashanah. Really, it's not. It belongs to both of them, and therefore it's not equivalent to a Rosh Hashanah. And therefore, when the brisa says that we're talking about a Rosh Hashanah, it's really referring to a simta. Okay. Okay, continuing this conversation. Bo minei Rav Sheshes me Rav Huna. Rav Sheshes asked Rav Huna, Kelev shel lokeach.
You missed the paragraph.
Where? It doesn't belong to neither of them, rather it belongs to both of them.
Okay.
Yeah. Bo minei Rav Sheshes me Rav Huna. Rav Sheshes asked Rav Huna the following. Kelev shel lokeach. So you have the vessels of the buyer, birshus mocher, and it's in the possession of the seller. Kana lokeach alone. So you have my vessel. I bring my basket into the seller's house, and now he places food into my basket. So I'm in the seller's domain. So maybe that's not good enough. On the other hand, it's my basket. So maybe that is good enough. The Rashbam explains the question that if you've acquired it, it's like he put it into my domain. Now, I don't own his house, but I have an object like a basket. So maybe we can consider that basket like it's my domain, even though I'm in the seller's house. Or you say, no, you look at the bigger picture. Where am I standing? At the end of the day, my location is in the seller's domain. So you can't really say, even if the fruits are in the basket, it's very hard to say that, oh, I brought the fruits into my domain. I didn't. I'm in the seller's domain. Or you say, no, at the end of the day, they're in my basket, and he says it's ki'ilu nasan l'sof rishuso. It's as if he put it, right? Symbolically, you can view the fact that I'm holding a basket, the basket's like my own domain, even though really I'm physically standing in the seller's domain. So that was the question posed from Rav Sheshes to Rav Huna. So Amar Le, Rav Huna responded, Tinisua, I'll bring you a proof from a case in Gittin. Zarkula, a husband throws a divorce document, a get, litoch cheka, into the lady's lap. Oh, litoch kalsa, or he throws it into her basket. So he throws it. So once again, the lady's in the husband's domain, but he throws the divorce document into her basket. Now, the rule by a divorce document is, the Torah says, v'nasan biyada, you have to give the get into her hand. And we learn her hand or her property. But you need to throw a get to somewhere in her property. So now she is still in your property. She's under your domain. She's married, so she's officially under your domain. And now what happens? You throw the document into her basket. So that's equivalent of seller putting food into buyer's basket while the buyer is in the seller's domain. So this would be a good proof. What's the halacha? Harezu migureshas. She is divorced. So you view the basket as if it's really her domain, and therefore you can conclude from there that if the seller puts the food into the basket of the buyer, so then he will also so that transaction is going to be good.
I mean, you can almost argue that a married woman really doesn't have her own domain.
Right. So what you have to say is what the Gemara says is gito v'yado b'aynik achas. They come together. That second that she gets a divorce document, at that second she also now has her own domain. They come simultaneously, right? It's like an eved, not like when a similar case would be that when you have a servant, so he's under the domain of his master. So how does he ever get free? Right. So it's the same thing that that the gita v'yadu b'aynik achas. So say something like that. Yeah, good. So it's interesting because by marriage, and you have a lot of cases where, not that this is happening here, but he can always give her, or she can bring it to the marriage and retain the rights. Meaning they can make a deal. They can make a deal before they get married, while they're married, listen, you keep the fruits and I'll keep this. I don't work for you anymore. They gave her certain things in return for certain things. She can back out on that. He can back out on that. But yeah, I was actually just looking at over the Rashbam would say that, but he doesn't make that point. But yeah, that's what you have to say. Yeah, good point. Okay, so says the Gemara, interesting line. Amar le Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman says, "My taima pashas le'mahi." Why are you proving our case from that Gemara in Gittin? Dimachula meya uchli be'uchla. I'm not trying to say uchla, but they pounded that case 100 times with a certain weight measure. Yeah. Meaning that case was so controversial over there. They gave so many answers to that Gemara of what that case is. Whatever the Gemara in Gittin was talking about, we had to answer that Mishnah is talking about. We're going to see now 5 or 6 different scenarios. So you can't just bring it as if it's like a simple case. Oh, look, she's divorced. The Gemara there went through 5 or 6 opinions of what the case is talking about. And we're going to go see them now, and they're all going to have one thing in common, that it's not exactly the case of a woman being in the husband's domain and just a nice simple basket. We'll see the different cases. The Amar of Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda said over there in Gittin. Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel. So what are we talking about? The first opinion over there was Vehu shahaisa kalsa teluyaba. The basket was hanging off of her. Okay, interesting. So if the basket was hanging off of her, so it's not on the ground. It's it's hanging off her, maybe off her clothing. Maybe she tied it to her hair. I don't know. So the Rashbam says it's similar to Hagbah. It's like picking something up. I mean, this get never hit the ground. It was always put into a basket that was hanging off of her. So therefore, it's gonna be like Hagbah. Now, Kinyan Hagbah, we know you can acquire anywhere. Hagbah says you can acquire Hagbah b'chol makom. So you can't bring a proof that my vessel in the domain of a buyer, so the seller's holding my vessel, or I'm holding my vessel in the seller's domain, that's not a Kinyan Hagbah. That's just a regular, it's like putting it into my rishos, just putting it into my property. But a basket with the woman that's hanging off of her, that's more similar to a Kinyan Hagbah. So you can't bring a proof from a Kinyan Hagbah to just a regular Kinyan where he puts it into my possession. Right? If I were to go and pick up the potatoes, that's a Kinyan Hagbah. If he puts the potatoes into my basket, that's not a Kinyan Hagbah. So you can't bring a proof from a Kinyan Hagbah to our Kinyan. Second opinion, B'reish Lakish Amar Kshura, it's tied to her. The Afal Pi She'ena Tluyaba, so it's tied to her, and it's tied to her, but it's not hanging. It's dragging on the ground. So she tied the basket to her, and then it is dragging on the ground. Okay, so therefore what? So what is that similar to?
Because it moves with her, it's considered her.
Because why?
It moves with her. It's not stationary on the floor.
It's not, so since it moves with her, that's like a Kinyan Meshicha, I guess. It's like a Kinyan Meshicha?
They don't.
Yeah, it doesn't say. Okay. Shura Alpha Pish, what is that?
The basket is tied to her, moves with her, is not considered to be in the husband's domain, but rather an accessory to the wife's body.
So meaning it's not considered, right. So that's another example of where it's not really in the husband's domain. Because the same way, right, when she's wearing her clothing, that's her domain. Her hands are her domain. So this that's tied to her is considered like it's part of her. So same thing, you can't say it's like a basket in the seller's domain because what's on her body is her own domain. Yeah, she definitely owns her own her own domain.
Yes, we keep hearing that a lot. It's my body.
That's in dispute.
That's funny. The difference is that what you're not going to hear is the 3 million sources of how unbelievable a woman and a married woman is in Judaism. That they're not talking about on the news.
Yeah,
there are thousands of pages of literature putting her on a pedestal. How amazing they are. if you have that background, then they wouldn't be so upset, But okay. Once again, thank God it's not recorded. Yeah. Okay. Rav Ada bar Ava Amar Kegon Shahaisa Kalsa Munechasla Ben Yarkoseha. You have the basket that is placed in between her legs, literally between her thighs. It's on her lap. So once again, that's her domain. That's not anymore the husband's domain. So it's not similar to our case. Rav Mesharshia Braid Rav Ami Amar Kegon Shahaya Baila Mocher Pasos. This is interesting. The husband is a basket seller. So since he's a basket seller, therefore, when she has a basket, he's not strict about where the baskets are in his house. So meaning he lets people put stuff down. At least his wife, or is about to be his former wife, but he lets her put down the basket anywhere he wants in the house. He has baskets everywhere. He's a basket seller. So once again, that area where she has the basket, she has the permission to put it there because he's not strict about where the baskets go. So therefore, that's also not the same case. That's not really his domain. He lets people with baskets, or at least his wife with a basket, put her stuff there. That's like, like renting a space a little bit. You have permission to use that space. It's like you walk into, happened this summer to me. We went into a millionaire's house. He was having an event with somebody, whatever it was. So like when you walk into the house, like the event's taking place in the main room, right? But you do not have permission to wander around the rest of the house. You have permission to eat in that room. This is where we eat. So it's like a similar, she has permission to put down, this area she has permission, but other parts would be considered the husband's domain. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Makom Cheka, her lap is Kinuya la Makom. Rabbi Yochanan Amar, Makom Cheka, Kinuya la, Makom Kalsa, Kinuya la. Her lap acquires for her, and Makom Kalsa, Kinuya la. Or where her basket is can also acquire for her because he allows her to put the basket anywhere in her house, meaning where he sells baskets. So both of those can acquire for her because it's not in his domain, it's really in her domain. Okay. Amar Rava, my time is Rabbi Yochanan. This Rabbi Yochanan that just said, her lap can acquire for her, or the area where her basket is could acquire for her. So, 1 second. Why does Rabbi Yochanan say that? What's his logic? Because like we just said, lefish ein adam makbid lo al makom cheka velo al makom kalsa. A person's not so strict if she about putting things on her lap. Meaning if she's in the husband's house, right? So he's not strict of whatever she puts on her lap, and he's also not strict about the placement of her basket. So once again, anytime the husband's not strict about a place, or a seller is not strict about where you can put things, so then once you're putting stuff there, it's considered like it's your domain. And if you have permission to put stuff there, so then that's considered like your domain. So therefore, after all these different scenarios, that's why you cannot bring a proof from the case of a lady with a basket from Gittin, because there were 100, it was pounded 100 times over. It's talking about one of these 6-7 scenarios. Ella, you want to bring a proof? Bring it from here. Pasha la meha, from our brisa that we start off today with. Pasha la meha, birshus mocher lo kana. If you're in the domain of the seller, lo kana, you've not acquired, achig be'ena, until you've lifted up the produce, or let's say the measuring cup of the produce, o achi yotziena mershuso, or until you've removed the measuring cup or your produce from the seller's domain. So that was one of the cases in our brisa. So what do you see there? Ma'ilav, are we not talking about Bikelav Dilokeach? That case of the brisa says when you have vessels that belong to a buyer, and now he's in the seller's domain, the only way to acquire the produce inside the vessel is by lifting it up or removing it from the seller's domain. What do you see from that brisa? Vessels belonging to a buyer cannot acquire for you as long as you're in the seller's domain. You either have to do a kinyan hagbah, you have to do a kinyan hagbah, which is the strongest kind of form of acquisition it'll acquire for you, or you can remove it from the seller's domain. But just putting it in your vessel in the seller's domain, we see from that brisa, would not be a good transaction. So Ma'ilav Bekelev Delokeach, says the Gemara, no, you know what it's talking about? It's talking about Lo Bekelev Democher. That case is talking about it's the seller's vessel. So if the seller puts produce that he wants to sell to you into his vessel, that vessel you have to lift up or remove out of the house. But maybe if you had your own vessel in the seller's domain, that vessel could acquire for you. So, lo bekelev democher, we're talking about a seller's vessel. So says the Gemara, umidereisha bekelev democher, and since the beginning of that brisa is talking about the vessel of a seller, seifa nami, the seifa where you're in a public domain, is also talking about bekelev democher. Yeah. Seifa nami bekelev democher. So says the Gemara, not so fast. Ema seifa, say that the seifa, the latter part of the brisa, is referring to where Ema seifa, birshus lokeach. Look at the seifa of the brisa. If you're in the domain of the buyer, what happened if you're in the domain of the buyer? The brisa taught us, kevan shekibel alav mocher kana lokeach. One of the cases of that brisa was, if you're in the domain of the buyer, even when the seller was holding his measuring cup. But if you're in the domain of the buyer, as soon as it got filled up the top, as soon as he agrees on the amount he wants to sell to you, even before the buyer did anything, the buyer has acquired it because you're in the buyer's domain. So says the Gemara, 1 second. If you're telling me that the brisa is talking about the vessels belonging to the seller, so how is this case going to make any sense? You have a seller and a buyer. They're in the buyer's house, and they're going through a transaction. Who does the vessel belong to? Well, you just told me that the brisa is talking about where the vessel belongs to the seller. So you have a seller has his own measuring cup, and he just filled it up with 5 pounds of sugar. And the brisa still says that as soon as he agreed on the amount, okay, I'm selling you 5 pounds of sugar, the buyer, without doing anything, has acquired the sugar, but the sugar's in the vessel of the seller. So that's not going to work. So what's going to happen? The ibi kelev democher, amai kana lokeach. Why in the world should the lokeach, the buyer, acquire it? It's in the seller's measuring cup. So what do you have to say? So asan lekelev de lokeach. That case of the seifa, the only way it's going to make any logical sense is if the vessel belongs to the buyer. If the seller is holding the buyer's vessel, filled up to the top, and said, okay, I want to sell you 5 pounds of sugar. Oh, right then and there, the buyer's acquired it. But that only makes sense if it's the vessel of the buyer. It's not going to make sense if it's the vessel of the seller. So now what do we have? We have a split. The beginning of the brisa, we need a chart, right? So the beginning of the brisa spoke about when you're in the seller's domain, right? We're talking about the seller's vessel, and therefore you have to lift it up or remove it. The end of the brisa, when you're in the buyer's domain, we're talking about the buyer's vessel. So says the Gemara, Umayi Paska. What's his split? Literally means like to cut. You're cutting it through. The first part of the brisa you're talking about, it's in the seller's domain, and it's a seller's vessel. And the latter part of the brisa is in the buyer's domain, and you're talking about the buyer's vessel. Says the Gemara, Umayi Paska. Says the Gemara, no, it's a very logical split. Why? Because Stama de Milsa Be Mocher. What's a regular case? Who owns the vessel when you're in the seller's house? The seller owns the vessel. You can use the seller's domain as referring to a store. For us, the easier picture. You go to a store, right? And the storekeeper is packing up your stuff into a bag. Who does that bag belong to? Seller. It's the whatever, the Safeway bag, the Fred Meyer. Right. That's the normal case. Says the Gemara, that's a normal case. When you go to the seller's house and he's packing stuff for you to sell, that's a seller's bag. But now, if you want to go to a garage sale, you want to go buy something for a garage sale, and the guy's selling a lot of stuff, at his garage sale. So he needs to have bags to bag up your stuff for you. Whose bags are those going to be? Normally it belongs to not the same thing. It's a seller. If you go to the buyer's house, so I guess, sorry, that was a bad example. If you go to the buyer's house, right, and now you go to the buyer's house, and the buyer wants to buy something from you. So, you have a friend at your house, and the friend comes to your house, and all of a sudden you're very interested in buying, he brings with him, I was going to say beepers. Okay, he brings with him a lot of items with him. And you're like, oh, those are great. Can I actually buy those Legos off of you? For my son. So whose bags are you using in the buyer's house? The buyer's bags. That's what the Gemara says. Stama de milsa be mocher, mani de mocher, shrichi. Be lokeach, mani de lokeach, shrichi. If you're in the seller's house, it's more common that you're going to have the seller's vessels. If you're in the buyer's house, it's more common that you're going to have the buyer's vessels. Okay. Whew. Yeah. Okay, let's keep going. Amar Rava, let's try to bring another support for this. Let's see how far we can get. Meaning how much I prepared. No, so let's see. Yeah. So I realize that's why on Shabbos it's an hour long Daf Yomi. You can catch up the whole week. That was our question. Why is it an hour on Shabbos and 15 minutes on the Must to catch up on Shabbos?
It's just easier to think about it.
That's right. You get more.
On Shabbos,
you get more help on Shabbos. The Shabbos is a more spiritual day, so you get more assistance from above. So that's, by the way, that's one of the understandings why it says on Shabbos you have an neshama yisera, an extra soul. What does extra soul mean? Some commentators say you have your brain, your intellect, it's wider, it's more expansive to understand more Torah. Interesting. Yeah. Okay. So Tashma, another brisa, taught us the following: Mashach, Chamorav, Poalav. So you've pulled a donkey and its workers, v'hechnisan l'soch beso, and you've brought this chevra into your house. Okay, so what's the halacha? Bein pasak ad shelo madad. Pasak means to agree. You come to an agreement, like a psak halacha, a conclusion. Bein pasak, you come to a conclusion about how much you're going to sell. Let's say $10 worth. Ad shelo madad, but you haven't measured it yet. Ubein madad, let's say you measured it, achelo pasak, but you haven't come to a agreement on how much you're going to sell this measurement for. Shnehem yecholon lachzer b'hem. Both parties can retract. So who are the two parties over here? I guess the guy that wants to buy, meaning the donkey has produce on it, right? And the donkey comes with its, with the workers, the people that are, the people that own the owners own the donkey and the produce, and you want to buy some of the produce. The produce has stayed on the donkey's back, hasn't moved anywhere. So whether you've measured out in a certain amount, but have not agreed on a deal of how much it's going to cost, or you said, okay, I'll buy $50 worth of produce from you, but you haven't measured it out yet, both parties, the buyer and the seller, can still retract. Why? Nothing's happened yet. No one's pulled it off the donkey. No one's done anything. They're just verbally speaking. Okay. Pirkan, let's say on the next Amud, let's say you've removed the produce has been removed from the donkey. And now where is it? It's being brought into the buyer's domain, right? That's how we started. The buyer pulls the horse and its workers, and he brings it into his house. And now the produce is removed from the donkey. So, and it's placed into the buyer's rishus. What happens? So now, pasak ad shelo madad, if you come to a amount of how much you're going to buy this produce for, or how much he's going to sell the produce for. Pasak ad shelo madad, ein shnei michol lachzer b'hem. Both parties can't retract anymore. Madad, if you've only measured it, ad shelo pasak, shnei michol lachzer b'hem. Both parties could still retract. So now, what do you see from here? Umedekela of the mocher. What do you have? You have the vessels of the mocher, meaning you have the bag of produce that was brought on the donkey into the buyer's house. Birshus lokeach. Umedekela of the mocher, birshus lokeach lo kana. So from the fact that the vessels of the seller are in the domain of the lokeach, and you've not acquired it yet, Right? You have to actually pull it off the donkey. If it's long as it's on the donkey, you've not acquired it yet. Yeah. Caleb, so too the inverse case, Caleb de lokeach, if you would have the vessels of the buyer in the seller's domain, so then Caleb de lokeach nami b'rishos mocher lo kana. So then you can learn from there that if you have the vessels of the seller, of the buyer, in the seller's domain, you also have not acquired it. 1 second.
Because the price wasn't set.
So we're talking about the case in the brisa where the produce is still on the animal's back, correct?
No.
It's been removed from the animal, and now it's in the buyer's domain.
If he set the price without measuring, if he set the price, neither of them can withdraw. But if he measured it without setting the price, both of them can withdraw.
You set the price.
So meaning, the case that we're talking about is only the case when the guy comes into the buyer's house. Pirkan, he's removed the object into the seller's domain. That's what it is. Okay, that's what it is. You took the object from the donkey. It's still in the vessel of the seller, right? You didn't unpack that. You just took it off the donkey's back.
Mm-hmm.
As long as it's still on the donkey, so then
No question.
No question that both people can retract. Nothing's happened. Once you've taken it off the donkey and you put it now on the floor in the buyer's domain, so now you see that it could acquire. Once you've came to a conclusion about how much you want to pay for it, so then both can't retract. So now, says the Gemara, but until you did that, right? Just the fact that there's the object in the buyer's domain, you have not acquired it.
It's on the ground.
Even it's on the ground. So it says the Gemara, say the same thing. If you'd have the buyer's object in the seller's domain, the buyer's, the produce is in the buyer's vessel, and it's in the seller's domain, so that's also not going to be acquired as long as it's in the seller's domain. You have to go and pull it out. So one more line, Amar of Nachman Bar Yitzchak, Bishishafchan. Nope, we're talking about a case where you actually took it out, spilled it onto the ground. So really, it's not anymore in the vessel of the seller. Now it's actually on the ground of the buyer's domain. So therefore, it's not going to be comparable to our cases. It gives Jules his 2-minute walk.